Welcome to the Becoming Superhuman podcast, where we interview extraordinary people to bring you the skills and strategies to overcome the impossible. And now, here's your host, Jonathan Levy.
This episode is brought to you by the all-new and very exciting Superlearner Academy. Now, Superlearner Academy is the home of my premium level content and masterclasses from my course on accelerated learning, speed reading, and memory, all the way to my course on productivity. Now, in these masterclasses, I go into the gritty detail that I just can't go into on the podcast or in the books or in the other online courses. I offer the worksheets and the homework and the types of individualized attention that can only happen in my own platform where I control the learning experience. So if you want to learn faster, if you want to remember more, if you want to read faster, and you want to be able to do this all with a cohesive 10-week program that's going to take you from wherever you are today all the way to certifiable super learner status, I want you to check out the exclusive discount that we're offering for podcast listeners only at jle.vi/learn. That's jle.vi/learn. Hey there, super friends, and welcome to the show. I am very excited to finally wrap up our 4-part series on Paleolithic nutrition. Now, in the past, we've talked with Rob Wolf and we've talked with Lauren Cordain, two of the founding fathers of what you could call the paleo movement. We've also talked with Michelle Tam, who's someone helping people all over the world practically implement paleo. Today, we're going to talk to someone who's actually not a part of the paleo community, so to speak, but is a huge crusader against wheat and grains and all the nasty stuff that they're causing in our society. So to learn more about this, we've invited the man who many consider to be the leading authority on that topic. Now, he's a cardiologist and a blogger, but he's also the author of many books, including the New York Times bestseller, Wheat Belly, as well as 2 Wheat Belly cookbooks, Wheat Belly Total Health, and his newest book, which came out the day after this interview, the Wheat Belly 10-Day Detox. Now, in this episode, we go into very, very deep topics with health concerns related to the typical Western diet. We get very technical, we get very scientific, and we learn in great detail about the physiological effects of grains. We also finally sort out what the deal is with cholesterol, LDL, HDL, what does it mean, why should you care, and why is the way that modern medicine looks at it completely wrong. We even learn some very practical and applicable tips for cleaning up our diet and health from a cardiological perspective, as well as just an overall inflammatory and general health perspective. This was a really, really fun episode to record, guys, because my guest had so much knowledge to share. He was so energetic and so passionate about the topic. And I just know you're going to come away with some great knowledge and hopefully some lifestyle changes. If that is the case, please reach out to us on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, on email, however you want to, and let us know what your favorite part of the episode was. In addition to that, I would love to read you guys a review that really touched my heart this week. The review comes from The Real Guy Lewis, who says, "Wow, exactly what I was looking for. This is the first group of podcasts that I've listened to from Jonathan Levy. I've been searching for a meaningful podcast that I can learn from, but also a podcast that has very intriguing and interesting guests. And I must say, I found it." Thank you so much, Guy Lewis. We do appreciate that. To hear your review read out on the air next week, leave one and we'll read it out. All right, so without any further ado, let me introduce you to Dr. William Davis. Dr. Davis, welcome to the show. We are very, very excited to have you here today.
Oh, thanks, Jonathan. Glad to be here.
So I understand that you are in the process of touring or promoting your latest book, so congratulations very much on that.
Oh, thank you.
And I want to get into that book and how it's a little bit different later. But first, I have to admit, I was very surprised that in my initial research for this interview, I kind of dug into your background, and I was surprised to find that you actually began your career as a cardiologist. So I'm very interested to hear your career trajectory and what brought you to where you are today as one of the top authorities speaking out against grains and kind of the perils for our health.
You know, Jonathan, I was practicing for many years as what's called an interventional cardiologist. I was the guy doing the heart catheterizations and putting in stents and atherectomy devices, cutting devices, all those kinds of things we did for coronary disease, that is heart attacks, chest pains, angina. I became very disenchanted with this notion that heart health is delivered through a procedure or a cath lab. I was doing up to 10 procedures a day. My mother died, by the way, of sudden cardiac death after her 2-vessel angioplasty. It drove home to me that this was really not a smart way to manage heart disease. So I started looking for better ways, better tools to give my patients to deal with heart disease. Well, long story short, you'll find that the number one cause for heart disease, heart attack, need for bypass surgery, sudden cardiac death, angina, stents, the number one cause is not high cholesterol. It's not fat intake. I call that the kindergarten version of heart disease. There's a long list of causes. And let's put aside obvious things that we can address, like smoking. Let's talk about the metabolic, the internal causes of coronary disease. Well, by a long stretch, Jonathan, the most common abnormality in people with coronary disease is an excess of small LDL particles. These particles, so people talk about LDL cholesterol. That's not really the cause of heart disease. It's the LDL particle. That comes in a whole range of sizes, shapes, conformations, surface charges, and they vary in behavior completely. It's like saying all animals in the zoo are the same. No, an elephant's different than a raccoon, right? They're all animals, but they're all very different. Likewise here in the world of this odd world of LDL particles. Well, the worst of the worst in LDL particles are small LDL particles, prone to oxidation. They're much longer lasting. They last 7 days in the bloodstream rather than 24 hours, like a large LDL particle. So where do people get small LDL particles? Well, only two things cause them, Jonathan, only two things. And this is not my speculation. The science is well worked out. Grains and sugars, period. Only grains and sugars provoke the formation of small LDL particles.
Wow.
And so I used simple logic. Let's take grains and sugars out of the diet. And by the way, these people who had coronary disease and had lots and lots of small LDL particles, a starting number would be something like 1,800 nanomoles per liter. It's a particle count measure, not cholesterol. Another common abnormality in these people is high blood sugar. They're almost always pre-diabetic or nearly pre-diabetic or even diabetic. So small LDL particles, high blood sugars. We take grains and sugar out of the diet. Small LDL drops to the floor. A typical response would be 1,800, drops to 0. Blood sugars would drop. Hemoglobin A1C, that long-term measure of blood sugar, would drop. But this is when people came back to me and said, well, I love this because I lost 43 pounds, but I wasn't trying. My waist shrunk by 6 inches in 4 months. I didn't even try to do it. I didn't even exercise. Why did my asthma go away so much that I got rid of 3 inhalers? This went on and on. And Jonathan, I told my patients at first, John, I have no idea why your rheumatoid arthritis disappeared and you could stop 3 drugs. So it happened so many times. It became clear this was not just some crazy, fortuitous accident. This was real. And that's when I started to ask, what the hell is going on here? That the food we've been told to dominate diet should fill breakfast, lunch, dinner, every day, all snacks should be a part of every meal. Why would removing that food with this halo, this blessing from all official agencies, right? USDA on down, why would removing it yield such extraordinary change? And that's when I started to ask, well, what? First of all, was it changed? Did it change somehow? And 2, if so, what's in it that would allow such wonderful health benefits to occur when you remove it?
Yeah, so let's get into that. Although first I want to ask, what are some healthy values? I mean, I know people tend to think that more HDL is good and less LDL is good, but it's so much more complex. And as you said, there are so many different types and sizes and shapes, and most people are not getting their LDL particle size tested. Do you think that's a mistake? And also, do you think we can tell something from the ratio between our LDL and HDL in our blood testing?
You're tackling one of the toughest topics of all. Yes, it's the way I landed on all this information, but it's also among the toughest. One of the problems you and I have, and you know this as well as I do, we're in a world where money makes all the difference, right? The statin drug franchise is now a $23 billion a year industry. So that fuels an astounding amount of disinformation, from good-looking drug reps. And we're inundated with these ads on TV and magazines. Statin drugs are so incredibly overused. Not to say there aren't a small number of people who would benefit. I think there are people who would benefit, but not. For every 100 people who take it, maybe 3 would actually benefit. We don't need the entire population taking these ridiculous drugs, because here's what happens, Jonathan. If you get rid of this silly notion of cholesterol testing, cholesterol does not cause heart disease. Cholesterol is a passenger on the particles that cause heart disease, and it can be deposited in arteries, but it itself is not the cause. To me, it's like saying, every car accident I've seen, there's gas in the tank of the car. Gas must cause car accidents. It's just an accompaniment. It's a passenger in the process. Likewise, cholesterol is not causative. It's a passenger. We're all made of cholesterol.
Right.
Our tissues, our brains, we're made of cholesterol. It is not causative. But the form it occurs, the fats and the blood particles, lipoproteins, fat-carrying proteins. And even that term's a little misleading, right? Kind of suggests that fat is the bad thing. It's not the fat. It's the behavior of the particle. And so if we did lipoprotein analysis, and these go by a variety of names, and I fear this has not entered the common conversation, so it's still a bit confusing to some people. Most of us call it advanced lipoprotein analysis. There are various methods, such as NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance. There's also electrophoresis. A company called Berkeley Heart Labs does that. There's also what's called vertical auto profile, VAP, offered by a company named Atherotech. There's some others. I think the best, by the way, is the NMR, offered by Liposcience, HD Labs, and SpectraCell. And I have no relationships with these companies, Jonathan. I've been doing this for 20 years. I just know who's who. And they provide, for very low cost, by the way, not much more than a cholesterol panel, this much more extensive lipoprotein analysis. And you'll see that cholesterol testing is a laughable fiction. It's nonsense. The numbers do not hold water when you compare them to true scientifically measured numbers. For one thing, they're measuring cholesterol, right? And cholesterol is not causative. 2, that LDL cholesterol, the number that's the focus of all statin drug therapy, is a fictitious number. It's not even a real number. It's obtained by a calculation called the Friedewald calculation, named after Dr. William Friedewald from the NIH from the 1960s, when they wanted a way to guesstimate the quantity of cholesterol in the low-density lipoprotein fraction. So they came up with this very crude equation. Well, anybody can add up 2 and 2 and plug some numbers into an equation, but the equation is deeply flawed.
Interesting.
And built into the equation are some assumptions. One of the assumptions, for instance, is that all particles, like those LDL particles, are all alike. They're all the same. Whether you're big, small, young, old, fat, skinny, diabetic, non-diabetic, cancer, doesn't matter. They're all the same. And that is completely not true. Now, in their defense, all this became clearer and clearer in the 50 years since that silly equation was made. But that equation, to this day, 50 years out of date, Jonathan, remains the basis for a $23 billion a year industry.
Amazing.
The tragedy here is I've seen this every single day of my practice. Let's say we did have somebody who had coronary disease. Scary stuff, right? My mom died of it. I watched people die of coronary disease, heart attacks and heart failure and so on. So it's not a trivial disease. You take these people where their primary care doctor or the cardiologist, the only solution they offered outside of procedures was cut your fat, cut your saturated fat, and take this statin drug. You'll see how miserably undertreated or even untreated they are by following that. Cutting fat, causes your pattern to be worse.
Right.
It increases expression of small LDL, right? Low fat, high grain.
Mm-hmm.
And taking a statin drug is nothing more than a crude shotgun for lipoproteins. It doesn't focus on the bad. It can even reduce the good. The net effect is not all that beneficial.
Sure.
The wonderful thing here is if you get it, I call this nutritional lipidology, by the way, where you can achieve astounding benefits in your metabolic and lipoprotein patterns if you just follow a few basic strategies. And you know what, Jonathan? The things I talk about to achieve these astounding and wonderful changes in lipoproteins and thereby your cardiovascular risk are cheap and nearly free.
Yeah, so let's talk about those. I wanted to get back, and I sense that this is a good segue back to where we started, which is your original book was Wheat Belly. And I think you're most well known as kind of a crusader against, as you call them, these wonderful things that are recommended by every regulatory agency and turn out to be killing us all. You know, we've talked a little bit with Rob Wolf on the show. We've talked a little bit with Dr. Lauren Cordain, but we haven't gotten into what's the big deal with grains specifically? Because your book's not called Sugar Belly. It's not called High Fructose Corn Syrup Belly. It's called Wheat Belly. And I want to know, especially because a lot of my friends and family are still on the train of, you know, we've been eating grains for 10,000 years and they can't be that bad. So what's the big deal with wheat specifically and grains like it?
Well, I picked on wheat first because it's the most dominant in diet in the way of grains. So if somebody says, I eat lots of healthy whole grains, they usually don't mean triticale.
Right.
Or amaranth, right? Or millet. They almost always are referring to wheat. So wheat is the most dominant grain in diet, and it's also the worst. Not to say less harmful grains like millet or rice are harm less. They do have harmful effects, but not achieving the magnitude, the serious level of harm that modern wheat is. Now, factor in here that agribusiness and genetics research also changed wheat. Now, these are changes introduced prior to the age of genetic modification. There are grains that have been genetically modified, such as corn, like Bt toxin corn and glyphosate-resistant corn, Roundup Ready corn. But wheat was changed prior to the age of genetic modification. But here's the odd twist on that, because you'll hear this from the grain lobby. Davis is wrong. No, wheat is genetically modified. I never said wheat was genetically modified. I said it was changed, but not using the methods of genetic modification. But here's the dirty little secret. A lot of the changes introduced into modern wheat using methods that predate genetic modification are in many instances worse than genetic modification, such as the methods of what's called mutagenesis, chemical gamma ray and X-ray mutagenesis, the purposeful induction of mutations. The difficulty with that method, while it can generate some of the changes that farmers and agricultural scientists desire, it introduces hundreds of mutations. Genetic modification, gene splicing, only provokes a handful of changes, 3, 4, 5 changes. That's it. The methods of mutagenesis introduce hundreds, if not thousands, of changes in a plant. So here's the twist. So while people are up in arms, rightly so, by the way, about genetic modification, we've been exposed to the products of mutagenesis for decades before genetic modification even got started. Methods that were in many cases worse than genetic modification. So the wheat of today is very different from the wheat of even 40 years ago, certainly different than the wheat of the Bible, wheat of pre-biblical times. So let's talk about chromosomes for a minute. I won't get too deeply in this. The wheat of the Bible is emmer wheat. That's a 28 chromosome plant. Humans have 46 chromosomes, right? A chimpanzee has 48. If we lay them out side by side, we'd see there's about 98% overlap in our genetic code. So about a 2% difference, 2 chromosome difference, but you can tell the difference, a big difference, right, between a human and a chimpanzee. Well, emmer wheat of the Bible, a 28 chromosome plant, is very different from modern wheat, which is a 42 chromosome plant. It's not the same. It's not even close. Wow. And then, of course, factor in all these changes that agribusiness and genetics research has introduced. So for those reasons, modern wheat is the worst of the worst. Now, I discourage people from saying we're going to be gluten-free, because gluten-free is filled with potholes and problems. So gluten's one protein in wheat and some other grains. There's a far better way to think about these things. And that's where, once you start digging into the reasons why modern wheat is so harmful, you don't find one thing like gluten. You find an entire arsenal of awful things in modern wheat.
Right, but was wheat ever really that particularly good for us? Is it just that modern wheat is so much worse?
Well, let's ask anthropologists. And I've always been impressed, Jonathan, how much they know about diet, but don't talk about it much because they don't really talk to us, right? To doctors and patients and people like that, the public. And they'll tell you when humans first turned to the seeds of grasses, that's what grains are. That's what wheat is. And that, in this case, was einkorn wheat, the 14 chromosome ancestral form of wheat. When humans first turned to the seeds of grasses, what happened to them? There was an explosion in tooth decay. Prior to the consumption of grains, 1 to 3% of all teeth recovered showed tooth decay. When we added grains, 16 to 49% of all teeth recovered showed decay, evidence for a deep infection, abscess, etc. We developed explosive levels of iron deficiency. You can see this in the fossil records. It's quite obvious. And this is because grains, including ancient grains like einkorn and emmer, have something called phytates. So the phytates in 2 slices of bread are sufficient to reduce your iron absorption by 90%. So iron deficiency anemia, a condition that affects 2 billion people on this planet, is largely caused by grain consumption. Not my speculation, by the way. This is from the World Health Organization. They know all about it because when they fly in, say, grains, particularly wheat, to a hunger-stricken area, they know they're going to have to take efforts, take steps to deal with the iron deficiency anemia that develops, and do such things as give these kids and people iron supplements.
Wow.
So that's just a partial list. We also know there was a change in bowel flora. There was a change in oral flora. And now we're all starting to appreciate just how important these bacteria are to us. They're not bad, they're good. But grains introduced negative changes in oral and bowel flora. We also saw a large increase in evidence for arthritis and joint disease. You know, one of the things we can't tell from people back then is whether the liver changed, right? Because we don't have any fossilized liver. So we have to go off limited data. But the changes are, this is not my speculation, these are the changes widely accepted by anthropologists. The human experience changed in many ways when we adopted the seeds of grasses or grains.
Wow. So it's really not just the gluten. I mean, we've talked on the show about gluten and fun stuff like intestinal leakage, insulin sensitivity, diabetes, all that good stuff. But it's also, I think it's what is often called anti-nutrients, right? These phytates that keep your body from absorbing things that it actually really needs, like iron.
Exactly. And I've seen this, by the way, play out many, many times. I've seen mostly women, by the way, who have iron deficiency anemia. They take iron supplements, even prescription iron supplements, and it's never corrected. It's resistant to treatment. Take grains out of the diet, right back up. Their hemoglobin, their blood counts go right up. So it's a very common effect. But you're right. There are many things in grains. So I highlight this notion that they are seeds of grasses. And I highlight that because, you know, when you think about it, when you cut your lawn in the summertime, can we save the clippings to toss on top of a salad with a little Roquefort dressing? You know, we can't. It's green. It's a plant. Why can't we eat it? Well, we can't consume, we can't digest the blades of grasses, the leaves. We also can't consume the stem, the roots, the husk. We try to eat the seeds. And only then, by the way, after extensive processing, such as removing the husk, drying it, pulverizing it, and reconstituting it with water as a porridge, or baking it, or brewing it, like as in beer.
Right.
Only then can we begin to consume it, but we still, even then, cannot digest many of the components in the seeds of grasses. For instance, wheat germagglutinin. It sounds like gluten, but it's unrelated. It's a lectin protein. And this protein, Jonathan, is completely impervious to human digestion. It goes in intact, comes out, goes into the toilet intact, though in its journey from mouth to toilet, does a lot of damage. Some of it does get into the bloodstream also. It's highly inflammatory. It's also a very potent bowel toxin in its path through 30 feet of human intestine. The gliadin protein within gluten is only partially digestible. And so you already know then, if the gliadin protein in gluten, in wheat, rye, and barley, and a similar form in corn, If it remains intact, it initiates the steps of autoimmunity, the bowel, so-called intestinal leak. But it can also be partially digested to small pieces or peptides, about 5 amino acids long. And these peptides have very unique amino acid sequences, very unique structures that confer opiate or opioid-like effects.
Oh, wow.
These are the things that cause constipation. They're bowel toxic. These have mind effects like mind fog, behavioral outbursts in kids with ADHD and autism, 24-hour-a-day food obsessions in people with bulimia and binge eating disorder, mania in people with bipolar illness, paranoia and hearing voices in people with paranoid schizophrenia. So there's a list of things in wheat and grains beyond gluten, like the phytates you point out, the anti-nutrient effects.
Wow. It's terrifying because so many people are eating these grains. I mean, the majority of the planet is subsisting off one form of grain or another. You know, I think a lot of people out there say, I don't feel any adverse effects. I don't have pain in my stomach. What do you say to those people who think I'm the exception? I get by pretty well eating whole wheat bread.
Nobody does, actually. Not to say that everybody has a perceived effect. So not everybody has a perceived effect. But if we check your blood work, you'll see almost as a rule an excess of small LDL particles, somewhat high triglycerides, somewhat low HDL. In other words, these are setups for heart disease and carotid disease. High blood pressure, higher blood sugar. We're talking about incredibly common problems. Here's another issue. Lots of people don't realize how many conditions come from grain consumption. For instance, they don't think that the cataracts they had at age 58 were from many years of consuming grains, but they are. They won't associate low back pain or knee degeneration or hip pain with grain consumption or disruption of sleep. Of course, all those unperceived problems. There's a whole long list of health problems that people don't generally regard as being due to grains.
Right. Or they're accepted as normal. I mean, we just accept that at a certain age, everybody gets cataracts, right?
Exactly.
Many people will get cancer and many people will get Alzheimer's. And we think that's normal for our species. And we chalk it up to, we're not supposed to live until 92. Well, actually, that's not true either, as we learned from Dr. Cordain.
Right. The positive side of all this is if you recognize this, you have, I love this, Jonathan, but what we're really doing is putting an astounding level of control in people's hands. So you and I are not advocating some expensive intravenous new drug like the ones I see on morning news every day now, the ads.
Yeah.
We're not advocating some expensive program of meal replacements and detoxification enemas. We're just saying shift your choices in diet and astounding things happen. Now, ironically, of course, the message in diet we're talking about is completely the opposite of the official advice given to us by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the USDA, the American Heart Association, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the American Diabetes Association, because they all agree, and to this day stick to it, that your diet should be dominated by the seeds of grasses.
Why is that, do you think?
They fell for some very bad science. It started with, so there are 14 epidemiological studies that show that if you replace something bad, white flour products, with something I would argue is less bad, whole grains, and there's a health benefit, and there is, by the way, and there's a reason for that. There is a reduction in type 2 diabetes, weight gain, heart disease, and colon cancer if you replace white flour with whole grains. What they didn't ask, which I think is the next sequence of logic, would be what happens when we remove grains.
Right.
Now, we can't look at those studies for those answers, but these studies do exist. So I'm sure Lauren Cordain and Rob Wolf talked about this because some of them come from the paleo world. When you eliminate grains, that's when you see really incredible stuff happens. But they fell, epidemiology does not prove very many cause-effect associations. It can only suggest an association. We don't know if it's causal. This is the reason why, by the way, millions of women were prescribed Premarin, purportedly to reduce cardiovascular risk and endometrial cancer risk, because the epidemiological studies suggested reduced risk when these women took Premarin. Well, there was finally a blinded placebo-controlled study, and the opposite was true. Premarin adds to heart disease risk and adds to endometrial cancer risk. So think of it, millions of women were needlessly exposed to the unhealthy effects of horse-derived estrogens.
Wow.
And same thing here. The epidemiological studies are flawed and should never have been used as the basis for policy, yet they were.
Wow. Dr. Davis, I want to ask, and I want to get in, we talked about how your first book was wheat belly because that's the most common thing. I want to get into some of the other things in our diet that we need to look out for. First, real quick, we have to take a quick second to hear from our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by the all-new and very exciting Super Learner Academy. Now, Super Learner Academy is the home of my premium level content and masterclasses from my course on accelerated learning, speed reading, and memory, all the way to my course on productivity. Now, in these masterclasses, I go into the gritty detail that I just can't go into on the podcast or in the books or in the other online courses. I offer the worksheets and the homework and the types of individualized attention that can only happen in my own platform where I control the learning experience. So if you want to learn faster, if you want to remember more, if you want to read faster, and you want to be able to do this all with a cohesive 10-week program that's going to take you from wherever you are today all the way to certifiable super learner status, I want you to check out the exclusive discount that we're offering for podcast listeners only at jle.vi/learn. That's jle.vi/learn. All right, we are back here with Dr. William Davis, and we're going to talk about some of the other things. Dr. Davis has recently put out another book, his 5th book, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yes, 5th book.
Excellent. Congratulations, by the way, again on that. And I want to get into why this book now. I mean, what's different about this book? What are the continuations and what are the other things in our diet that we need to be looking out for?
Here's a complaint I get with some frequency. I read the Wheat Belly books. I still don't know what to do. Or I'm too busy. I just don't have the time to understand all the science. And by the way, the original Wheat Belly laid out some of the history and the rationale. There are 2 cookbooks, and then there's the Wheat Belly Total Health book. And I wrote that because common situation. Somebody does the Wheat Belly lifestyle, and their rheumatoid arthritis is 70% better, or their type 2 diabetes is better. They're off insulin, but they're still needing oral drugs, and they want to become non-diabetic or don't have rheumatoid arthritis at all. So in the Wheat Belly Total Health book, I show people how to reverse health conditions as fully as possible, as humanly possible. So we talk about other strategies to consider. And these are all natural, wonderful strategies, John. There's no talk of drugs, not nonsense. All natural. You know what? With those added strategies, people are given extraordinary control. But lots of people start this conversation and say, I'm overwhelmed. What do I do? So all I did was I laid out in very, very simple fashion, day by day, menu by menu, meal by meal. Here's what you eat. Here's how to incorporate some of the additional powerful strategies. One of the strategies incorporated is an easy way to incorporate prebiotic fibers. Because it's becoming clearer and clearer, almost all modern people have screwed up bowel flora. And one of the reasons why people, let's say, can go wheat or grain-free and still not have full restoration of health is because your bowel flora is screwed up. Wrong species, overgrowth of bad species, etc. So I show people how to easily incorporate the strategies for correcting bowel flora. What I did was I created what's called a detox shake. It's a shake you make every day and incorporates the things you need to feed bowel flora.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it doesn't require people to understand that we're going to cultivate Lactobacillus plantarum, but it's an easy way to navigate. So I'm hoping this will make it easy for a lot of people, and for a lot of people who said, you know what, I did it for a year, I lost 70 pounds, I got so much better, and then I thought, maybe it wasn't so bad after all, so I went back. I regained 50 pounds, and you know what? I realize now I really have to stay in this lifestyle. How do I get back on as soon as possible? So there's people like that too. So it's meant to be a practical solution for people.
I love that. We were talking with Derek Sivers in a past episode, and he said, you know what a lot of books are missing out there is just the Get Started Quick Guide, because there is a percentage of people out there, 20% of people, they don't need to know why. They just want to know how. Okay, I understand you're the authority figure. Just tell me what I need to do in order to be more productive or in order to fix myself. And I love that this new book caters directly to those people and to anyone else who's read the other books and can now approach it with an enthusiastic mindset towards applying it.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Davis, let me ask this. I'm not sure exactly how the diet you advocate for differs from paleo. So I wanted to ask your thoughts on things like dairy, legumes, fruit, and potatoes.
I applaud all the people on the paleo lifestyle because it is a heck of a lot better than the average American diet. But I think this notion that you should only eat things that were consumed prior to 10,000 years ago is really needlessly restrictive. In other words, we've added things to our diet. We've added a lot of bad things, no question about that, like high fructose corn syrup. But you know what? Some of the things we've added are actually good. Avocados. There's no real good counterpart in the Paleolithic diet, but that's good for you. There's nothing bad in an avocado.
Right.
How about coffee? I love coffee. And there's really, if you don't consume, extreme amounts, coffee actually has modest, very modest, beneficial effects. Alcohol, how about a glass of red wine? That's not in a Paleolithic diet, but it has benefits. And it's a lot of fun to have a glass of wine.
Sure.
So there's lots of things that I think are, it's also subject to the eye of the beholder. That is, the paleo diet from one observer can be very different from that of another observer.
Sure. I mean, I know Rob consumes all those things, as do I. So I think it is this very subjective thing, unless you're a nutritional anthropologist.
And, another issue with paleo, that is pre-Neolithic lifestyle, that is prior to the advent of agriculture, is the Paleolithic diet of the Pacific Northwest was different from the Paleolithic diet of the Amazon basin or the rainforest like the Yanomamo, was different from the Paleolithic diet of South Africa, was different from the Paleolithic diet of Southeast Asia. In other words, it's not so much a single way of eating. So one of the questions I ask is, what was common to all those varied, extremely varied eating styles? Well, none ate grains. None had sugars outside of fruit, seasonal fruit. None had processed oils like cottonseed oil or soybean oil. So I think those are the lessons to take from a Paleolithic lifestyle. But I would say we don't have to be that restrictive, because there are some good things that have come along recently that I think do fit easily and nicely into a modern lifestyle.
I love that. So in your crosshairs is pretty much all the major grains, but other than that, you have a much more flexible stance to those other foods we talked about.
Yeah, we added dairy. I know dairy is a concern for you. We added dairy at the same time, more or less, when we added grains. And by the way, that's a whole story in itself. That is, what happened when humans first turned to agriculture? Well, that's when we domesticated aurochs into cows and ibex into goats and so on. That's when we, by the way, brought those animals into our adobe huts or other living places. And that was the birth of zoonoses, the diseases we got from grazing ruminants, like smallpox and tuberculosis and measles. So a lot of the diseases we regard as human diseases are really the diseases we brought on ourselves by this crazy thing we did with the grazing ruminant creatures. And by the way, I got to believe it was watching their behavior when we live so close with them. They all graze on grass. And so when starving humans ran short of food, as happened 10,000 years ago, we must have been inspired by our grazing ruminant partners in our house, and they ate grass, and we tried also. So that was also coincident with the incorporation of dairy, the product of bovine mammary glands and other creatures. So dairy products and grains are relatively recent additions to the human dietary experience. We've incorporated those foods less than 0.5% of our time on Earth. If human time on Earth was compressed into a 24-hour day, we added grains and dairy at 11:54 p.m.
Right.
We added it just a moment ago, speaking anthropologically. So that explains also why dairy has some outsized problems. Now, unlike the Paleolithic approach, I think some dairy is okay for some people. The problem in dairy is mostly in the proteins, casein, whey, and some others, and the sugar, lactose. But ironically, the healthiest part of dairy is the fat. The fat in dairy is really healthy for you. It's a rich source of, for instance, of butyrate, which is a gut healer. It's a wonderful effect on intestinal health and on metabolic health. And butter is nearly pure fat. So butter actually is one of the best things we could eat. But as we go down the line of other dairy products, now we run up against problems with the casein protein. That is the immune system stimulation of the casein protein. Casein behaves a little bit like gliadin from wheat, rye, and barley. It is immunogenic. We also have the problem of hormone content in dairy products.
Yeah.
Even organic. It's less in organic, but in high volume dairy production, we have a lot of problems with the hormone content. So dairy's not without its own problems. But I think some dairy consumption, but particularly high fat. So ironically, right, we're told to drink, skim milk or fat-free dairy. And when I go to the grocery store, if you look for yogurt, you can't find full-fat yogurt anymore. You have to make it yourself. The fat's the best part. So if possible, full-fat, organic, and minimize your protein exposure, dairy protein exposure. And the best way to do that is to focus mostly on butter, organic full-fat butter, and fermented cheeses, because the fermentation process modifies protein structure somewhat and reduces lactose content.
I love that answer. I'm feeling a little bit guilty that I recently picked up a tub of whey protein because it's just so convenient, but I know that those proteins are not good for me, and you're not the first person to say it at all. Dr. Davis, I wanted to know, who are some of the people whose work you follow? Who are some of your role models in the industry?
Dr. Cordain, he has been incredibly prolific. So while we don't agree on some of the surface details, you know what? He has done an astounding amount of thinking and work in this area. So he's done a ton of work that I think is truly admirable. And he's played a big role in bringing the conversation about diet. So I'm not fond of calling it the paleo diet because I think that's overly restrictive. But you know what? He has changed the national, now international conversation in diet. So he's done a great job. There are some people who you wouldn't know about, like Dr. Ron Krause in San Francisco. He's the guy who published tons of data on how grains and sugars cause heart disease, cause expression of the small LDL particle. Alessio Fasano, Dr. Fasano, formerly at University of Maryland, now at Harvard, he's the researcher. He and his team worked out the incredibly complicated way, the pathway by which the gliadin protein of wheat triggers intestinal leakiness.
Oh, interesting.
Astounding. By the way, a process that affects people to various degrees, 90% of us. So we're not talking about the 1% with celiac disease. We're talking about 90% of people exposed to the gliadin protein of wheat, rye, barley, perhaps the zein protein of corn, have this in some degree of intestinal leakiness that initiates the process of autoimmunity and amplifies inflammation because it lets bacterial byproducts through the intestinal barrier. So
wow.
I wouldn't be surprised his work earns him a Nobel Prize because his work is so astounding, so detailed, so insightful. But it tells us now why grain-consuming cultures have growing levels of autoimmune diseases. Autoimmunity, while it's not as tracked as well, say, as cardiovascular disease or cancer, the best data we have suggests that it's growing at epidemic levels and now affects 8 to 11% of the North American and Western European populations. We're talking about a lot of people with very crippling diseases, and it's another statin drug industry story unfolding. That's why we see all those ads on TV with, golf champions and TV stars all talking about the drugs they take, because those drugs cost $1,800 to sometimes $4,000 a month.
Wow.
And you take them for a lifetime. Think of that. So that's why it's so important you and I talk about these kinds of things. Because, a guy like Dr. Fasano did the work, and he tries to talk about it some, but he's busy in his lab. And so it's up to people like you and me to talk about and cultivate the national conversation so that people know
Absolutely.
the diseases of autoimmunity are largely a disease of grain consumption.
Absolutely. And if that's not an invocation to share the podcast episode, hint, hint to our audience, then I don't know what is. I wanted to ask actually, and I didn't get a chance to earlier, do you ever turn the other cheek, look the other way, and have a slice of birthday cake on occasion? Or have you completely written off grains as if they were poison?
Here's an odd thing, Jonathan. So this is true for the majority of us. If you've been grain-free for at least a few weeks and you have an exposure, the exposure may be on purpose. As you're pointing out, maybe it's a slice of your son's birthday cake, or maybe inadvertent. Maybe you're at a restaurant and didn't realize that the gravy had a little bit of wheat flour. You're going to get sick. And most commonly, you get diarrhea, abdominal pain for about 24 hours. It's most common. Other people get joint pain, particularly in their fingers, wrists, and elbows. It can last days. If you had an autoimmune disease, let's say rheumatoid arthritis, and you got off 3 drugs, and the disfigurement is receding, you're getting back normal flexibility, and you're feeling great, and you have an exposure, you can have all that stuff, disfigurement, swelling, pain, etc., return for months.
Wow.
If you get sick when you get re-exposed, it's its own kind of self-policing effect.
Sure.
So most people that I deal with, they say, you know what? I tried it and I felt so awful that I realized I can't ever do that. And so most of us who do go grain-free never go back.
Sure. I cave probably about once a month. I was in Italy a couple of weeks ago and I couldn't resist the pasta, of course. And I caved, and then I feel so lethargic and lousy after.
Yeah, that's a very common observation. Exactly right. Here's another thing a lot of people don't know. I learned this through 20 years of dealing with it in coronary disease and heart disease. So if I eat fat in my diet, let's say the fat in my pork or some coconut oil, whatever, I provoke formation of large, people say large fluffy LDL particles, which are fairly benign. And they last 24 hours, and then they're cleared by your liver. If I consume, say, some bread or a bagel or multigrain, whatever, I'm going to provoke formation of small LDL particles, and they last on average about 7 days. See, I learned this in real life practice. The science is also already out there, but in real life, this is what happens. A guy will say, Friday is my bad day. I'll have one slice of pizza every Friday, or whatever your choice of indulgence is. Well, that person thereby provokes formation of small LDL particles that cause heart disease risk. So one indulgence a week causes cardiovascular risk 52 weeks a year.
Right.
Yeah. So that's important to know also.
Yeah, that's a pretty good invocation to not do the cheat meal once in a while. And if you do it with something like, a fruit shake or something that's less full of these anti-nutrients.
You can also appreciate the magnitude of how wrong the conventional notion of diet is. Cut your fat, eat more healthy whole grains. We'll try to treat the excess cardiovascular risk that we've created using statin drugs.
Right.
That are costly and cause added dementia and increase your likelihood of type 2 diabetes quite substantially.
It's ridiculous. I had a friend who went on statins and essentially started losing sensitivity in his fingertips. Well, it turns out that myelin, which covers the nerves everywhere in your body, is made of cholesterol.
Yeah.
And if you don't need statins and you're put on them, well, you get some pretty serious nerve damage. And that's when I realized all this stuff, these statins they're not all they're cracked up to be.
And John, this is why it's so important that you do what you're doing. Cultivate the conversation, get people to think, bring people with varied ideas, because you know what? It's never going to come from the likes of the American Heart Association, who, by the way, is largely supported by big food and big pharma. It's never going to come from the American Diabetes Association because it's all the drug industry and the grain industry, by the way, who support them. And so it's like a corrupt politician or dishonest politician who listens to his lobbyists, his high-paid lobbyists, but doesn't listen to his constituents. Same thing here. These agencies have kowtowed because of money to the deep pockets of industry, and they essentially gave us a message that causes human disease.
Right.
But that's why what you do and other people like you trying to propagate this message, that's why this is so important. In the age of social media and empowerment of the individual, this is what we should be doing.
That's very flattering, Dr. Davis. Thank you very much for the kind words. I also wanted to ask, we love to assign homework on the show. And like you said, the dialogue is very important, but getting people once they get out of their car today and they've listened to this podcast episode, we want to get them acting on this information. So we like to assign homework, whether that's reading, a 1-week experiment till next week's episode, or even sometimes a downloadable worksheet. So I wanted to give you the opportunity to assign our audience that one piece of homework that they're going to complete this week.
It's such an easy thing to accomplish when you think about it, right? Removing all grains. But there's a 2-step process to follow if you want to do that. Remove obvious sources like bread, bagels, and pancake mix, but also be aware that the food industry, I think, is smart. They have smart food scientists and recognize the opiate appetite stimulating effects of wheat, and that's why wheat is now in virtually every processed food. So if you don't understand that, you'll be exposed to wheat and wonder why you're not obtaining the same kind of health benefits other people are. So it involves removing all grain products, obvious and hidden, and turning to what I call real single ingredient foods: pork chops, lettuce, green peppers, onions, real foods that you are confident do not have grains. And that is a big start. And by the way, I should mention, people who are new to this conversation, if you stop the flow of opiate peptides from the gliadin protein of wheat, rye, barley, and the zein protein of corn, you're going to have an opiate withdrawal syndrome.
Oh, yes.
Some people call it paleo flu or Atkins flu. It's actually an opiate withdrawal syndrome from the gliadin-derived opiates. And it's fatigue, nausea, headache, and depression. And it can be quite awful. And it lasts about 5 to 7 days. And that's why part of my books is show people, one, don't tell yourself, this is my body telling me I must need grains. Just like a heroin addict is going to go through withdrawal, you're going to go through a withdrawal process. And you'll feel hugely better when you emerge from it. And there are steps you can take along the way to help you feel a little bit better. But like having the flu, Jonathan, there's no way to not have some of those effects. So you got to grin and bear it, get through it. There are some simple, common sense steps you can take to soften the blow. And that's what I talk about in the books. But we're talking about a process that affords astounding return of control over health. And by the way, that's been my message. So I didn't really set out to pick on wheat or the wheat industry. What I set out to do was give people better tools to take back control over their health. I don't like to see what healthcare has become, because healthcare to me is not the system that makes people healthy. It's a system that tries to profit maximally from sickness. And it's guilty of overuse, overcharging. So I want people given effective tools for taking back control of their own health.
Fantastic. That's a great note to end on. Dr. Davis, your latest book is the Wheat Belly 10-Day Detox, which we will link up in the show notes. It has very recently come out, at least at the time of this recording. It's a very new book, so congratulations on that. And if people want to get in touch with you and learn more about what you're doing, check you out online, maybe get in contact with you, where should we send them?
The easiest places to start, Jonathan, are the Wheat Belly blog, where a lot of these conversations are ongoing, and the Wheat Belly Facebook page. It's called the official Wheat Belly Facebook page because there's, as anything that becomes very popular, there are knockoffs from other people and not me. But those are the two most, and they're very busy places, lots of active conversations, a lot of people who are experienced and help others, the newcomers. So lots of activity, lots of great stories, and lots of, by the way, success stories. I'd love to believe that this movement is growing because of my good looks and charm, but it has nothing to do with me. It has to do with the wonderful effects people are having. And so if you look on in particular, Wheat Belly Facebook page, you'll see the astounding before and after photographs, some of them as soon as 5 days, Jonathan, 5 days. People look, I should mention that real quick. People's appearance changes in 5 days, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, because yeah, you're losing weight. Yes, most people lose astounding amounts of weight following this lifestyle. But even more than that, they're losing inflammation and edema, water retention. And you'll see startling changes in facial appearance. And I can't show you someone's healed rectum or their hard to show, dropping blood sugars, but I can sure show you changes in their face. And so those are fun to look at.
I love that. I'm going to check that out right now, actually. Dr. William Davis, it has been such a pleasure, and thank you so much for your generosity of time and wisdom. I do hope we'll keep in touch.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. You keep doing what you're doing because it's very, very valuable.
Thank you very kindly, sir. You have a wonderful day.
You too.
All right, super friends, that's it for this week's episode. We hope you really, really enjoyed it and learned a ton of applicable stuff that can help you go out there and overcome the impossible? If so, please do us a favor and leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher or however you found this podcast. In addition to that, we are always looking for great guest posts on the blog or awesome guests right here on the podcast. So if you know somebody, or you are somebody, or you have thought of somebody who would be a great fit for the show or for our blog, please reach out to us either on Twitter or by email. Our email is info@becomingasuperhuman.com. Thanks so much.
Thanks for tuning in to the Becoming Superhuman podcast. For more great skills and strategies, or for links to any of the resources mentioned in this episode, visit www.becomingasuperhuman.com/podcast. We'll see you next time.